Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to talk about writing about identity as a counselor. Now, as we go through, there will be many opportunities for us to shape the examples that we give based on who you are, what you're interested, what program you're in, and other things like that. So I encourage you to participate as we go along by typing in comments and questions in the chat room. And let's dive in. If you're not familiar with the ACU Online Writing Center, we work with students at any stage of the writing. It could be you've just gotten the instructions and you're not sure how to even get started. You could have a thesis statement or a problem statement or a paragraph or anything up to and including a whole draft that you want to get feedback on. Most students work with us through what we call asynchronous appointments, where you schedule an appointment. By the appointment time, you upload a copy of your paper, and then within 24 hours, we send you feedback on that. We can also, by request, do phone and Zoom appointments if our capacity permits. So for example, if you're asking for an appointment where we arrange a time and then we share your document on a screen and talk through it and you pose whatever questions are on your mind, it's easier to do that in the first half of the semester. If we're talking finals week when everyone's rushing to get their final papers in, that's less good time to ask for that. But what you do is you can either send in an email to the Online Writing Center. That's ACU Online Writing Center at acu.edu. Or you can go ahead and just make a regular appointment and then put a note saying, I would like to have a phone or Zoom appointment, and give us a set of sample times. So let us now turn to talking about more things like what we're doing today, which is a webinar. So we have a whole series of resources that we've developed for students. Some of this is in response to needs that we see directly, and some of it's from questions from students such as yourself. So if there's a particular assignment or topic that you'd love to see a webinar on, let us know. You can do that by sending us an email, by mentioning something in the chat, or when you RSVP for a webinar by simply stating, oh, I would love it if you had a webinar on this, because we do read that and we have added new webinars every term in response to requests from students such as yourselves. Speaking of, we have a whole series of webinars coming up. And if you can't make one of our webinars, we always archive recordings of these on the Writing Center website. So if you wanted to go to literary analysis in the Bible, but you had a meeting during that time period, all you have to do is check back on the Writing Center website, and usually within 24 hours, we'll have the recording posted. Or just when you RSVP for it, and you'll be on the list to get a link to that recording as soon as it's ready. So coming up right after this, we have assessing problem statements for the EDD program. On Thursday, we have literary analysis in the Bible, followed by another EDD in progress webinar, this one about contemporary leadership theories. And then next Tuesday, we have a new installment in our Writing as a Nurse series and several more besides. Today, we are going to focus on three things related to one particular assignment in the CONR program. And one of the things we want to do is to help make sure that when you approach the assignment instructions, that you understand that it's actually asking for a very specific list of things to do. And that by understanding exactly what it's asking for and why, you're better able to meet the requirements of the assignment and get full credit. So we're going to start out by looking at the importance of having a theoretical lens when you're looking at and talking about identity, that you consider what your own self-ascribed identities are, because that's an important part of this assignment, and that you also then go into the assignment looking at the instructions in the rubric as a list of things to do. So let us start with the first objective. So identity and counseling theory. There are a whole lot of different theories out there, but there are a couple that come up a lot and that you will recognize in the reading. And one of the reasons for that is that the concept of identity and how we construct it affects what we value. And so it becomes a key part of many different theories that look at how do we create a system of value or understand value. And in counseling, often part of the process becomes how do you get people to understand what they value and that other people value things that may be different from their own. Let's look at Simmons and 2017 model of alcohol and drug counselor identity development. Now, this is something that was developed to describe the results of a study to understand, okay, well, what do groups of alcohol and drug counselors tend to have in common? How do they see their or identify themselves as having an identity? And from the study that they did, they found that there are a couple core elements: education that get to that job, the professional development that you do as part of maintaining your active credentials, this formal certification, and the personal experience. It's no surprise that many people get into areas of counseling in which they have some experience. And so you may, from your own marital experience, decide, oh, I have something to say about marital counseling. Same thing with conflict and crisis and other things like that. And in this case, it turned out that a common element they saw in their model was that people would have personal experiences with drugs and alcohol. Sometimes it was themselves, sometimes it was someone in their group of intimate family and friends, but whatever it was that they found, oh, here are these core elements. And from that, they also found, oh, so we can look at this and say, okay, here, what seem to be the best practices that everyone values and says, okay, this is what you have to do to be a good counselor, like using cognitive behavior therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, and the stages of change model. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other things that you can use, but in this particular group of drug and alcohol counselors, these were things that they recognized as this is what we as a group seem to agree. This makes you a good professional alcohol and drug counselor. So take a slightly different tact. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. Another important thing here was the commonality of multiple identities, that people didn't just identify as that, but they were often wearing a lot of other hats, and that this was something that they do, but rarely the entirety of how they defined themselves. So let's look at another theory that is in the reading for this particular assignment. Let's talk about social identity theory. Now, there are many different versions and elaborations of social identity theory, some adapting it to very specific contexts. I'm going to talk about Tafel and Turner's 1986 write-up of this, which is a very important one that comes up a lot in the family counseling literature. And this theory predicates three core elements: social categorization. This is how we sort things together in our social lives. Social identification, what we say, this is me. And social comparison, how we evaluate where we are or what groups we're in compared to someone else. And this theory also states that individuals engage in a everyday, common, habitual process of categorizing the people and things in their social world into two supergroups: the us and the them. If you've just joined us, we are talking about some of the key concepts towards understanding my identity assignment in CONR 602. So don't worry, you haven't missed it too much. We're just talking about the background theory and how that helps to understand what the assignment is asking you to do. So yes, social identity theory, we've got the core elements of categorizing, identifying, and comparing, the understanding that individuals engage in a common everyday process of categorizing other people and things into these super groups or super categories of us and them, and that people get positive self-conceptions. They view themselves in a good light from how they build and maintain their self-esteem through memberships in some number of groups. Let's do some examples. I am on the faculty at Abilene Christian University. I haven't always been. There have been times in my career where I've been what's called an independent scholar. Most of the time, that doesn't matter one way or another. I do my work, etc. But when I go to libraries and archives and such to do research and they ask, what is your institutional affiliation? I happen to like putting down, oh, faculty, Abilene Christian University. Is it a big thing? No. Is it a way that I identify? Oh, yes, it is. Is it positive? And is it something that, to some extent builds and maintains my self-esteem? Yeah, I like being a university faculty person. And for whatever reason, it is something that I value. And it is something that sometimes gets me access to things that I wouldn't otherwise, like having to do less paperwork or paying a different rate or something like that. And so this is part of how our memberships, these groups that we see ourselves as being part of, we perceive members in our groups to some extent as being better than the groups that we're not a member of. Or so social identity theory explains the world. Whether they're actually better or not, that's a question for someone else. But do people see things positively? Oh, yeah. I am from California. I've lived in California. I've lived in Boston. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. If I meet someone who is from one of those places, I know I automatically like them more. And since I started working for Abilene Christian University, I automatically like people from Texas more. It's because I'm like, oh, yes, we're part of the same group. Tell me about it. And there are other things that you can develop it, but a lot of this stuff is not where I sat down and said, well, I'm a Texan today. Now, I have heritage and lots of family in the state of Texas, but when certain things happen, when I was hired by ACU, it's like, oh, I have entered this group. I see myself as part of that. So let us move to, these are just citations in case you want to read up on these. Let's talk about self-ascribed identities. These are the identity categories we give ourselves. And part of the assignment that we'll be looking at asks you to do this and to come up with a way to visualize how they relate. So let's talk about that. What are some of your categories? Here's some of mine. I see myself as Catholic, a musician, a homeowner, a brother. I have 10 siblings, by the way, 4 brothers, 6 sisters, a professor, problem solver, a writer, a son, a theater director, composer of music, writer of poetry and other things sometimes, and a change maker. So these are some of the identities I give myself that I self-ascribe. It's not someone else coming and saying, you are X. This is me saying, I am these things. Now, the list could be very long, but now there's a question of, well, okay, what are the most important ones? What are the key aspects of my identity that I think are relevant and shape my interactions more so than others? And these are not necessarily static. They tend to change over one's lifespan, which is why, if I just say, okay, I need 4 of these, I'm going to bold some more than others. Homeowner, problem solver, son, and change maker. Why these 4? Well, I might answer differently if you caught me in a different situation or a different day, but homeowner right now, due to COVID, I spent an awful lot more time in my home than normal. And so I feel that I'm defined by where I live and how I live more so than before. Problem solver. Yeah, I do a lot of other things, but I see it as, here are things I look at in the world and say, well, that's not working right. Let me see what I can do. Son, at an earlier point, the sibling relationships were probably higher on my mind, but I have aging parents and I see a lot of what I do in relation to that. And change maker. There are things in the world that I say, I believe in changing that. And whether we're talking about voting or what I do at my church or what I do teaching, I see that as an overarching category that kind of encompasses some of the other ones. So if you are so inclined to share, tell us what some of your identities are. And while you're thinking about that, let's look at the CONR 602 assignment that's going to be our main focus today. So this is the My Identity assignment, number 4. And do make sure that you watch the video by Dr. Fleming before you delve into it, because it really does make a lot of the details of what you're doing easier to think about. But one of those tasks is to create a visual illustration of the elements of your own identity. And that this should include personal identities and group or social identities. All right. Well, if we could go back to my earlier list, I would say that I do see the homeowner thing as being a group identity. I identify strongly as a resident of my neighborhood. I love my neighborhood, and I think that changes a lot of things. You know, we have a couple inches of snow that fell today, and I went and I shoveled half the street because it's how I identify there. So that's a group thing. Problem solver, that's really an individual one. A son, that is, I would say, a group identity for me, and change maker is a personal one. So if I was to draw these according to the diagram, okay, let's see what our instructions are. Create a visual illustration of the elements of your own identity. Include both your personal identities and your group social identities. Should be more comprehensive than the list you created in this week's class discussion. All right, I'll bite. I'll go ahead and I'm going to take a piece of scrap paper and I am going to draw out my identity in real time. And I invite you to do the same. I'm just going to take maybe a minute to do this. And then I will go ahead and share the picture. So I encourage you to start making a list and try your hand at drawing this. And while you're doing this, keep in mind, there is no right or wrong answer. You are drawing your identities. Now, I saw a question here about the course. So this webinar that we are doing right now is a webinar for students in the CONR program, the counseling program. Immediately after, at 7 o'clock Central Time, we have a EDD in progress webinar. So this one here is on CONR. The EDD webinar this evening is in about 40 minutes. So you're welcome to stick around, but we'll be getting to that particular webinar then. So no problem. So again, back to this, there is no right or wrong answer about what this diagram should look like, except that it should in some way reflect how you see how your identity is organized. You might cluster things in bubbles or have them like Venn diagram where you have overlapping spheres, or I'll show you what I'm doing in just a moment. And yes, if you're planning on coming back for the webinar, you can certainly step out and rejoin us on the hour. So when you're working on the flowchart, again, think about how do things connect for you, whatever that means. And I've just finished mine. And so I'm going to go ahead and draw this up now and take a picture and share it with you. Now, again, no right or wrong answer about what this should look like, just that you are required to make an illustration. It probably helps if you are working with a nice blank sheet of paper and a pen, but it doesn't have to be terribly fancy. And in fact, you'll see the one that I have chosen to make up here is not very fancy at all. Let me go ahead and share my screen there. So you can see I've drawn the identities that I had earlier, and I put my kind of family identity in the middle. And my religious identity is, closely linked with some other things. And I've arranged some stuff like, here's my creative cluster that connects together, and it connects to various other things. And this is how I have chosen to visualize it. Again, no right or wrong answer. I can make this look a little bit cleaner visually by going ahead and playing around with the appearance just as you would with any other photo. So I'll go ahead and I'll increase the exposure. There's, I'll crop this a little bit. And that just looks a little bit nicer. All right, let's go ahead and look back at the particulars of this assignment and where this is going to come up next. All right, so if you create your illustration by hand, be sure to scan or photograph it and include it with your paper. This section does not count towards your word count for this assignment. All right, so if you were to be creating it as a flowchart in Word, for example, don't worry about the labels and it taking up your space here. All right, and just to be clear, everyone should be able to see my slides right now still. All right, so let's look at these instructions here. All right, so introduce the paper, great. What are your 4 to 5 core identities? You saw my 4 earlier. Where and how were each of these aspects of your identity formed? Okay, then some other things. Think about the last time these were threatened. All right, describe how you responded and analyze this through Northrop. Great. In your opinion, why does identity have such a major impact on a person's response to conflict? Support your view with information from the course, the textbooks, or other material. In your opinion, how does your identity impact your personal conflict style that you discovered in Module 1? So there's a lot of reflection here, a lot of, okay, how do you see these things happening? How do you understand what is going on? And then some specific things about questions to respond to about what dysfunctional patterns you have that you exhibit in conflict, and which issues lead you into repetition compulsion. Okay, so we have a list of very specific things that are supposed to be covered. Then a reflection about how your own words and actions contributed to a conflict. Okay. And then a specific scenario. Okay, consider a long-standing conflict with which you're personally familiar and to analyze that using some of the material. Okay, that's actually pretty clear. My question is how long it should be, and the instructions tell us here. So 2,000 to 2,200 words. So a paper in APA style, meaning 12-point font, double-spaced text, and things like that, 1-inch margins, that's going to be about 250 words per page. So this means this paper should be more or less 8 to 9 pages in length, not counting, the references or the title page and things like that. It also says include a subheading for each rubric line and do not quote sources. Okay, good to know. Here's the rubric, breaks down, and we see this is basically marching through everything that was given before and giving a heading, so make sure you include that. And if we look at the instructions here, include a subheading for each rubric line, that tells me that the paper is supposed to be divided into this. Everything except for introduction, because in APA style, you're not supposed to have a heading introduction. It's just, we know the start of the paper is the introduction. Okay, so let us begin here. What you're going to see after this, I'll be using the APA course paper template that you can download through that link. Let me go ahead and grab that. And I am going to then share my screen in Microsoft Word, and we'll spend the next 20 minutes or so just going through the process of doing up an outline here. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, you should see my screen now. Please let me know if the text is not large enough to read easily. So what you'll see when you open the document is that this is a template file that has some instructions and some placeholder text and some stuff that you probably want to delete right away. So in our case, we're going to take all of this placeholder stuff and we're just going to delete it right away. We're also going to head, and because this assignment doesn't ask for an abstract, we're just going to delete this entirely. And now I'm going to go ahead and fill in the details here after I've removed the comments. Go to review, and I'm going to go ahead and say delete all comments in document, and they're gone. All right, well, here's me. Can fill in the rest of the course stuff there. What's this paper going to be? I'm going to call it My Identity, Son, Professor, Problem Solver, Homeowner. Doesn't need to be a fancy title. Just needs to be informative. In this case, saying what assignment it is and something about it. That's all we need. All right, so now what's going to go in here? Well, we were looking at the assignment instructions earlier. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy and paste those from the webpage of the assignment. And we'll start out and I'll just paste them there and say, okay, you know, that's a different font and stuff. Let's match the formatting there. That's not doing it. Let's go with keep the text only. Not quite right. So undo that. And so I'm just going to go through this manually first. All right, this is just instructions on the formatting. All right, we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to take all this out now and say, okay, so the rest of this, I can go ahead and I'm going to take this and I am going to change it into text to match the basic formatting here because we want it to be double spaced, 12-point Times New Roman font. Great. So now it looks like it belongs with the rest of the template. All right. So my illustration. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and grab that. And in APA style, when you have an image, we call it a figure. And so this figure is going in, and we're going to call it my this is my illustration of identities. It's not a fancy title, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be descriptive. Great. And I look at this and say, all right, that's my visual illustration. And that's all it says to include it. All right, great. Done with that. Now I have the list of things I need to write about. So I'm going to start and I'm going to delete things like this that already done, don't need to worry about that. I need to introduce the paper and my 4 to 5 core identities. All right. And got a few other things here. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this chunk here and I'm going to put this above the figure. So we're starting the paper because we need to start the paper with an introduction. All right, so what are my 4 to 5 core identities? Well, I can go ahead and put something here in the outline saying, and our and say, all right, I did that one. I can cross that off. All right, where and how were each of these aspects of your identity formed? Well, some of these are going to be sooner than others. All right, that's my first one. But if we look at this and say, okay, it's asking about core identities, I can make it more clear that I'm referring to that by incorporating this wording. So rather than saying as a defining characteristic, say, I'll align my terminology, I'll use core identity here. However, I've only embraced this as a core identity in the past 10 years. And look at this and say, okay, I've done each of these to some level. And if I want to expand it, I can leave this here. If I think I'm done with it, I'll cross it out. All right, great. So think of the last times that one or more of these identities were threatened. How did you respond? Interesting question. Son, professor, problem solver, and homeowner. Well, here's one that may be part of the identity for all of you this last year. We have had exceptional and unusual health conditions across the world. And so that has definitely conflicted with my normal problem-solving abilities because there's some things I cannot do. So rather than say my identity, my core identity as what? A problem solver. And then go in and fill that in detail until you can cross off this. And so you go through step by step because this is really a guide for how you should be structuring your paper. And as you do this, you can look at, after you've responded to all the prompts, you can look and see, okay, how long is this? How much do I need to fill it out or trim it to meet the length requirements? Now, in this case, there are some other aspects of the instructions that we want to make sure we don't forget. If you'll recall, one of the instructions was include a subheading for each rubric line. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that rubric again. In this case, let's look at it on the website. So we have the introduction, identity illustration, recognition of core identities and their formation, personal experience of identity threat. So as I go about filling in this outline, I should also go in and start adding headings for this. Now you might ask, well, okay, what level of headings do we have? Well, just based on what we have here with this list, these appear to be sections of approximately equal weight. So let's give them all APA level 1 headings, which means that the text will be centered and bolded. And if we see something that seems like it should go in a subheading, that will just make that an APA level 2. But right now, we're just talking APA level 1 headings because this is the largest level of division. All right, well, let's go back to Microsoft Word then. So based on what we saw, we have some headings to add here. So, okay, there's a heading for the identity illustration. Great. That's telling me that this here should go in the first subsection after the introduction. So here, I'm going to paste that in, get rid of those bullets I accidentally added. And I'm going to add a heading. The heading will be identity illustration, which is exactly the text that's in the rubric. So if my professor is going through and looking to see, did they do that? It will be very easy. And I'm in fact going to go ahead and use the styles pane here. And I'm going to say, okay, this highlighted text, make that APA level 1. You can see it automatically gets bolded and centered. So I don't need to worry about those details terribly much. I just apply the style and boom, half is done for me. All right, now next on the list is putting in recognition of core identities and their formation. All right, so recognition of core identities and their formation. You can even copy and paste these straight from the rubric and just change the capitalization to title case and then add the heading and there we go. And so you want to go through each of these in turn because your instructor has given you a very detailed list of what to write in what order, and having just a shorter paragraph, maybe 5-6 sentences each, you will very quickly find that, oh, that's just answering all the prompts has totaled the number of pages we need here. Okay, so let's see, continuing on here. All right, my core identities, okay, and then, oh, hey, the section that I was starting to fill in here, that is going to be personal experience of identity threat. And so this is a process that it may seem a little tedious the first time you do it, but it's very simple. And if you just take a couple minutes, you can get all these headings added in less than 5 if you do it all at once. And let's see, next on this here, identity's impact on personal conflict style. And so on and so forth until you've done the whole list. So where are some of the traps here? Well, one of the traps that people run into with this assignment is they don't look at the instructions as they write it. They read the instructions, say, okay, I understand what I'm supposed to do, and then they just start writing. And that usually leads to two things. One is writing more than you need, because you could get very, very in-depth into talking about where these core identity formations came from and how they happened and when they happened. And you can also very easily miss things, because just looking at this, there are 9 subsections with their own headings here. Besides the introduction and conclusion, there are 9 headings. And it's very easy to miss one and say, okay, I talked about the identification of identity threat, and then miss the identification of issues that draw into conflict section that's supposed to go in that. This is why I recommend starting by copying and pasting the instructions into the template and developing this as an outline where you respond to each thing in turn. And then when you're done, cross it off. Then go through and add these headings so you can check and see, yeah, I got all 9 of them. All right, let's spend some time looking at one of these particular prompts here. So this one here, think about your personal reaction to conflict in light of what Shapiro called the repetition compulsion. So this is a prompt where it's asking you to analyze your own experience, making reference to the literature here. Now, let's cover some context here. So Shapiro, we're not just talking about Shapiro writing in general. We're referring to a particular source, a particular text. And in this case, this is going to be D. Shapiro's 2017 book, Negotiating the Non-Negotiable, How to Resolve Your Most Emotionally Charged Conflicts. So it's one of the core course materials, lots of reading from this, and you're being asked to analyze your personal reaction using Shapiro as the lens that you look at this, to show what stands out, what's important, what's in focus, if you will. All right, so let's spend a little bit with this just so we can talk about how that would appear. So dysfunctional patterns. What's a dysfunctional pattern? Well, if the textbook definition of dysfunctional is something that's not operating normally or properly, we could go another step and say not operating normally or properly and causing harm or discomfort, because you might have a particular way of speaking or an accent that's not quote unquote normal for this context, but that's not causing trouble usually. So let's say the dysfunctional pattern has to be something that's causing some trouble or discomfort or stress here. So in this case, let's talk about some of the common ones that can come up in relationships. We could have lack of communication, or poor communication, or what we call the communication shutdown, when someone just refuses to talk about things. We could have something like aggressive opposition. Let's make a list of 2 or 3 here, and then we'll come up with a list to go in. Okay, let's say vicious circle. This is when things never get better. They just keep going around, and they hurt you, so you hurt them, or they were cold to you, so you're cold to them, and now everyone's angry and upset and so forth. And I think that's enough for us to make an example here. So how would you go about doing that? Well, first you start creating this list, and then you start spinning that into a sentence. When I am in conflict with, and let's specify someone. So let's say in our example, this is going to be a conflict with a spouse. When I am in conflict with my spouse, as I often exhibit dysfunctional patterns by failing to communicate, by aggressively opposing suggestions that my spouse suggests, and by escalating things until we are trapped in a vicious circle. Now, you'll see that the way that I've written these has expanded on the notes that I have here. So since I've now incorporated them, I'm going to go ahead and cross those out to indicate to myself I did that. And it's not just stating what the patterns have. There's, okay, when the pattern occurs, what is threatening in the identity? So, all right, well, I have a question that I'm supposed to be answering. It's probably going to be in the same paragraph because it would be very natural to talk about this right after mentioning, well, here are my patterns and here's why they come up. And in this case, our hypothetical person is going to be introspective about this and say, these patterns typically come up when I feel that, okay, let's take a very common one from the last year. When I feel that my ability to provide for the family, there are a few things that can be as all-encompassing a stressor as money or fears of financial insecurity. It does not make anything better. So in our hypothetical situation where our author is going through this, they said, oh, here are the patterns that I have. That's usually comes up when my ability to provide for the family is threatened, or they feel that their ability to provide for the family is threatened. Now it says, be specific and introspective in your explanation. One of the best ways to do that is to explain by example. For example, after something happened, okay, let's take another common thing that could have no fault. After a tree branch fell on our car, and then you go on and you develop this example. State what you know, state what that means to you, what you understand it means to the other person. And again, it says be specific. So in this case, it's explaining how that feeling led to all these other things. Now, how would you analyze this with reference to Shapiro? Well, we're not going to spend all of our time with this text here, but we have time to talk about this briefly. So the concept of negotiating the unnegotiable. So how best to put this? Sorry, negotiating the non-negotiable. So if we were to go ahead and dive into this book here, we have a couple things here. One is that Shapiro really does delve into the concept of things being emotionally charged, that it's not the inciting incident so much as how we do that and how that reflects what is value to us. And so one of the things that Shapiro brings up to combat this, there are a couple concepts here, and I'm going to go ahead and bullet them here. So one of this is to resist the repetition compulsion. Yeah, resist the urge to just keep doing the same thing. And respect the sacred. Now, what we treat as sacred, metaphorically or literally, is a very subjective thing. I can tell you that I have some friends who are very okay with one spouse in a pair making more money than the other. I also have some friends who aren't so okay with that. And they know that that's not something that they think is right, but it's something that is kind of like they've inherited as a sacred tradition, and so it's hard to change. So how might these come up in the discussion here? You might write something like, well, I know that I should resist the repetition compulsion as suggested by Shapiro 2017. I have found this to be very hard to implement. And what that does is it says, okay, so I know there's this thing I should do. Shapiro suggested it, but it's hard. It's not working. And similarly, you could go delve into this and talk about the sacred part. When my wife and so now the question is, well, how would you talk about that? And you can, again, go back and reference that. Oh, Shapiro recommended a practice of mutual agreement to respect the sacred. And so again, as you take your notes and you expand them into a larger passage, keep track of it and just use the cross out tool. And then you know, oh yes, I took care of that. I wrote that in. And so if you go through the rest of this outline, filling it in, very soon you'll find that the whole paper is written and you just need to delete these, do a little bit to bridge, and you are done. So this concludes our webinar for the CONR 602, Writing About Identity as a Counselor. If you have just joined us and you are here for the EDD webinar, you are in the right place. We are going to be continuing on in another 5 minutes. But if you are just here for the CONR webinar, we are done. If you did not RSVP and you do want to get a copy of the recording and the slide deck, just type your email address in the chat window and I will send it on to you. Otherwise, have a great evening.